There's no question that J.R.R. Tolkien was a brilliant writer of prose. But what about Tolkien the poet? Tolkien wrote numerous poems throughout his life, many of which feature in his Lord of the Rings and Hobbit narratives. In this video, I'll be looking at Tolkien's merit as a poet and analysing two of his most beloved poems. Tolkien's poetry has received a lot of criticism over the years. Poet Alan Bold took issue with the supposed sentimental silliness and contrived internal rhyming of Tolkien's verse. I think this criticism is far too harsh. Tolkien wasn't primarily a poet, but he was certainly a skilled writer, and the purpose of his poetry is mainly to serve the prose. The poems and songs add another dimension to the fictional world and stories he's created. You can't really analyse them outside of their context. Many of the criticisms, as Tolkien himself noted, however, stem from the fact that his poetry doesn't adhere to modernist ideals of poetry. His verse appears old-fashioned, perhaps to many even hackneyed, but that's the point. His verse fits the context of the fantasy world he's created. It's simple, enduring, even pleasantly nostalgic. So, beginning with I Sit Beside the Fire and Think by J.R.R. Tolkien. I sit beside the fire and think by J.R.R. Tolkien. I sit beside the fire and think of all that I have seen, of meadow flowers and butterflies in summers that have been, of yellow leaves and gossamer in autumns that there were, with morning mist and silver sun and wind upon my hair. I sit beside the fire and think of how the world will be when winter comes without a spring that I shall ever see. For still there are so many things that I have never seen. In every wood, in every spring, there is a different green. I sit beside the fire and think of people long ago, and people who will see a world that I shall never know. But all the while I sit and think of times there were before. I listen for returning feet and voices at the door. I Sit Beside the Fire and Think is a song sung by Bilbo Baggins the evening before the Fellowship sets off on their quest. It's often cited as one of the best poems by Tolkien, and I have to agree that it's a really charming and accomplished piece. What I love most about this piece is its simplicity, and how well it reflects the aging hobbit who is reciting it. So to begin with the structure of the poem here, the lines are alternating 8 syllables and then 6 syllables in length. It's iambic tetrameter, a line consisting of 4 iambs, unstressed stressed syllables, and iambic trimeter, a line consisting of 3 iambs. The effect of this is that we have a statement and then a fall. So the iambic tetrameter lines have much heavier stresses than the trimeter. If you compare I sit beside the fire and think to of all that I've seen, the first line has a lot heavier rhythm created by the repetition of those short, punchy I vowel sounds in sit, beside, fire and think. The second line, however, lessens the stresses with more drawn-out vowel sounds of all, have and seen. It's these longer vowel sounds that are rhymed with the A-B-C-B rhyme scheme. Been, seen, be, see, before, door, which creates a pulling back down to the ground, as though Bilbo's reminiscences are constantly being tugged and weighed down by the reality of this situation now. His day has passed. He knows that. The alternate lines reinforce it in a sobering but not overtly tragic way. Tolkien does a brilliant job of balancing the bitter and the sweet in this poem. His language helps enormously. There are constant mentions of simple pleasures, summers, butterflies, the fireside, woods, autumn, sun. These are all very visceral words. They conjure up a multitude of pleasurable feelings and associations in the reader, which helps to manufacture that bittersweet tone. We have the repetition of the line, "I sit beside the fire and think," on the first, third and fifth stanzas, which again acts as an anchor pulling us back to the present. It also adds structure to the poem, helping to break it up into clearly defined thoughts. And perhaps it's also reinforcing the idea of age, as the elderly speaker has to continually prompt himself to recall his memories. We have some alliteration in the second stanza with morning mist and silver sun. This helps to increase the pace of this line, perhaps mimicking the autumn breezes that are mentioned in the following line. Sight is the primary focus, however, being directly mentioned 4 times throughout the poem. This may be to act as an antithesis to Sauron's sight, but also could highlight the importance of light against Sauron's darkness. Bilbo is sitting in the dark by a man-made light, remembering past sunlight and the beauty it created. Light is repeated constantly throughout the poem as Bilbo savours all that was good about the world and gives hope to the good that will come. Winter will come, the difficult times will come, but so will the spring whether he lives to see it or not. And this is the message he appears to be conveying to the fellowship on their journey. The simplicity of this poem is what makes it work so well. It reflects the uncomplicated, relaxed and nostalgic feelings of home. It is very distinctly a Hobbit poem too, rooted in the natural world, the senses and simple pleasures, with a practical, acknowledged acceptance of what is to come. In many ways it's a very reassuring poem, which leaves the reader comforted by Bilbo's wise outlook on life. Now I will look at the second poem, The Lament for the Rohirrim by J.R.R. Tolkien. Lament for the Rohirrim. Where now the horse and the rider? Where is the horn that was blowing? Where is the helm and the hauberk, and the bright hair flowing? Where is the hand on the harp string, and the red fire glowing? Where is the spring and the harvest, and the tall corn growing? They have passed like rain on the mountain, like a wind in the meadow. The days have gone down in the west, behind the hills into shadow. Who shall gather the smoke of the dead wood burning, or behold the flowing years from the sea returning? The Lament of the Rohirrim is actually one of my favourite of Tolkien's poems. It draws inspiration from a much earlier Old English poem called The Wanderer, which is an Anglo-Saxon lament composed sometime between the 9th and 10th century. It's about a warrior who has lost everything, his home, his lord, his fellow warriors, and the narration follows his thoughts as he tries to navigate his grief and newfound loneliness. It's a profoundly moving poem that's well worth the read. Tolkien's The Lament of the Rohirrim, however, is a lament recounted by Aragorn, which is thought to be about the now faded glory of Eol the Young, the first king of Rohan. It's also the first introduction to the riders of Rohan. Tolkien has used the same alliterative structure as the original poem and kept the ubi sunt theme. Ubi sunt, meaning where are they, was a common motif in Old English poetry. It comes from the Latin phrase ubi sunt qui ante nos ferunt, where are those who were before us? These types of poems focus on mortality, nostalgia for the glorious past, and the passage of time. We have the repetition of the question where, which is the focal point of the poem. This reinforces the idea of loss. The word is repeated, and our desperation grows as we fail to find the thing that has been lost and cannot be replaced. In these lines we also have the repeated H sound of horse, horn, helm, etc., which helps to elevate the urgency with a breathless tone. The constant H's mimics the sound of panting and really helps to convey the seriousness of the poem. If we look at the structure, you can actually split this poem in half. The first 4 lines have a much faster pace, helped by the repeated sounds, the rhetoric, and the AABB rhyme scheme. But the last 4 lines slow down as they break from the initially panicked feeling of the first 4. The last 4 lines are an answer to the first 4. All those things have passed. The greatness has passed. Such is the nature of mortality. And this is how we are introduced to the Rohirrim, via the tragedy of mortal existence, because that's what makes men stand out in Tolkien's world, their short lifespan. I love Tolkien's use of half-rhyme with meadow and shadow, as this really helps to break up the pace of the earlier lines and makes these lines stand out, as though they were a thoughtful pause. He also moves from the material world, helm, halberd, harp strings, to the natural world of rain, mountains and meadows, as the speaker realizes the material, mortal world is governed by the same ephemeral tides of nature. Nature will ultimately outlast man. The men who interacted with it pass away, with very little surviving evidence of their existence. This poem holds more weight for me when we consider that Tolkien was a soldier in the First World War. So he would have understood this perspective, and the perspective of the speaker in the Anglo-Saxon Lament, The Wanderer, better than most. The line, "The days have gone down in the west, behind the hills into shadow," is particularly sombre, as to go west to a First World War soldier meant to die. It was trench slang for dying. See Siegfried Sassoon's poem Lamentations. So those past days haven't just set. That whole world has died, and its memory is hidden, faded, lost. We as the reader understand before we even meet the riders of Rohan that these are a once glorious people whose glory has long since faded and who are navigating their grief for their lost past, believing they can never live up to that again. But the last line is somewhat hopeful, as it asks, who will there be to watch the washed away glory returning back to them? Overall, I think Tolkien's poems are extremely successful. He uses his technical skill to tailor each poem to the culture of the races they belong to. We can tell a Rohirrim lament from a hobbit song at a glance. The same goes for elven and dwarven pieces too. This is perhaps the greatest feat of his poetry, that they so successfully serve their purpose to better convey the history, culture, and beliefs of the people in his stories. To be able to fully appreciate the depth of the pieces, the broader context of the narrative is required, and many who understand the lore much better than I do will be able to get even more from them, I'm sure. However, some of his poems, like these two, stand out as enjoyable pieces in their own right, and in my mind certainly dispel any doubts about Tolkien as a successful poet.